Morning. There was a young man who had a pronounced stammer, and he decided to visit a renowned speech therapist. Now, the therapist was known for his unconventional methods of treatment for such problems. And he had the young man talk with a mouth filled with marbles. And each week he would allow him to take just one out. Amazingly, the treatment proved effective, and his speech began to improve. And finally, after he'd lost all his marbles, he became a preacher. That is absolutely nothing to do with the talk this morning. Bit of a gratuitous joke, really. We've come to the end of our series of talks on the highly gifted, the inventive, the resilient Old Testament figure of Nehemiah. And we've learnt that it was the time of the Babylonian exile, and Nehemiah was a servant of the king. We also learnt that when Nehemiah heard of the desolate state of the city of Jerusalem, he was filled with compassion. He was moved to prayer, and then he was moved to action. Because the city was broken and the people were broken. Well, we learnt that he inspired the Israelites to rebuild the city and its huge defensive walls despite incredible opposition. He righted grave social injustice and poverty. He stood firm against plots to kidnap him, to intimidate and to malign him. And last week we heard from Hayling how he encouraged people to give of themselves to God, to give of their very best. And so we come to the last two chapters. And in chapter 12 we have a detailed list of individuals who were the priests and the Levites. I was going to ask the minister to read that passage for us because it includes about 100 unpronounceable Hebrew names. I know how much she loves those. But I've spared her that. And in the second half of the chapter there is a rededication of the city. And there's a huge celebration of worship and joy as people give thanks for what God has done. And crowds of people come from all the surrounding towns and villages. There's music, there are singing choirs, and there's tremendous thanksgiving. The great city, Jerusalem, had been rebuilt and restored. The great covenant, that special relationship between God and his people, is remembered and restored again. A dispirited and dejected people were back on the road of being a great nation once again. A chosen people, ready and willing to serve God and to serve each other. Well, what could possibly go wrong? We're going to pick up the story in chapter 13. That's Nehemiah 13, starting at the first verse. On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber, where they previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions of the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God, with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled, each to his field. The rest of the chapter goes on to tell how the practical and due portions for the Levites and singers, the worship team if you like, had drained away, and they'd gone to the fields to make ends meet. And there were officials that were responsible for administering these offerings, and they had neglected their duties. It goes on to talk about the observance of the Sabbath, which was a central element of Jewish religious practice. That too had just drained away, and it had become one more trading and shopping day. The men had married foreign women, or more particularly Ashdod, Ammon and Moabite women who were Canaanites, and to whom Jews were expressly prohibited from intermarriage. Nehemiah was upset that the children of these marriages did not know the language, let alone the faith of their Jewish fathers. So it was after 12 years of working for the people in Jerusalem that Nehemiah went back to the king of Babylon. And it seems that no sooner is his back turned than the wheels start to fall off the great Jerusalem project. And the account of devoted choristers and gifted instrumentalists, greatly valued priests and Levites, is replaced by a story of despondent priests, silenced singers, disobedient tradesmen, ungodly merchants, and spiritually negligent husbands. The inspirational leadership of Nehemiah had given way to the damaging and complicit leadership of Eliashib. Now, this particular priest had been given an important role in overseeing part of the temple, but he had abused his position, and he had allowed Tobiah the Ammonite, of all people, if you remember, he'd been one of Nehemiah's most sinister and outspoken enemies during the rebuilding. He'd allowed him to set up residence in rooms within part of the temple. And these were rooms that should have been set aside to store the offerings and tithes to support the Levites and the priests. Right at the beginning of that chapter we read that no Ammonite was permitted to enter the assembly of God. And yet here was Tobiah with a luxury apartment inside the sacred temple. Now, this story gives us a stark warning about spiritual carelessness. It shows how easily and how quickly things can slide. It seems unbelievable that after all the effort and hard work of rebuilding the city, all the solemn vows to honour God, the confession of their sin, the pledges of the people to sign up to a covenant, and all the fervent celebration and worship, within, it seems like a fairly short space of time, it all counted for nothing. Was it a rapid or a gradual decline? We cannot be sure, but perhaps it doesn't really matter because the end result was the same. It seems that a healthy and committed spiritual life in 1 year is no guarantee that it will always be so. I thought of my New Testament and the Apostle Paul. He wrote warmly about Demas. in the same breath as the ultra-reliable and steadfast Dr. Luke. He was a trusted and committed Christian brother, a fellow worker, an assistant to the great Apostle Paul himself. How hard it must have been for Paul to write shortly before his death, "Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me." And this falling away can happen not only to individuals but to whole churches. In Revelation we read about the church at Ephesus. It says this: "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary." This is a vibrant, active church. But then it goes on, "I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first." So Ephesus, the once shining example of the early Christian church, they had zeal, they had a passion for the truth, but they had lost their passion for Christ. That lampstand was in time removed, and the church became no more. So what can we learn? We need to recognise the very real dangers of materialism. Money and possessions mean more than God. We know that food and drink and shelter will satisfy the needs of the body, but envy and greed are insatiable. This, of course, is not a new phenomenon. It was just as true in the days of Nehemiah as it is today. Maybe it's a little tougher today because that influence reaches every nook and cranny of our society. Perhaps consumerism has become the new religion. Perhaps our moral and ethical standards need to be held up to the bright light of Scripture rather than today's relativism, where what is right or wrong can depend on individual circumstances, prevailing customs, and sometimes our personal preferences. This story shows us that good leadership is crucial. There may be different styles of leadership, but a Christian leader needs to have a servant heart. First and foremost, a heart and a passion to serve God, and a heart of compassion to serve others. But just as importantly, a leader needs support. There's no good leading from the front when the troops have turned and gone in the opposite direction. A leader needs to be able to share leadership, be an effective coordinator, be able to delegate, to have integrity and be of good character. Now, the tricky bit is that all this does not just apply to the minister. Many within the church have some leadership role, even if we don't wear the badge. So here's my challenge to you for this week. First of all, consider where you might have some form of leadership role. Maybe within the church, maybe at work, almost certainly within the home. We have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, who look to us as a role model. I hope you found this series on Nehemiah interesting and thought-provoking. He is an exemplar, someone worthy of imitation. He's an excellent example. And he's shown us that to achieve great things, we need to rely on the one who is greater than us, the incomparable and only God. We need to turn from self-preoccupation, passing fads and theological novelties, and fix our gaze on the reality and the holiness of God. Sound teaching from Scripture and encouragement from fellow brothers and sisters will do much towards that goal. But ultimately, it is for us. It is for the believer. It is for you and me to convert that knowledge of God into action and a commitment to live the life to which we are called. That life should be reflected in prayer, expressed in humble service, tested in conflict and adversity. It should reflect God's love to others, be proved in perseverance, be steadfast in faith, but wholly dependent on grace.